Hi, and welcome to the Art of Film Funding. I'm your co-host, Claire Papin, along with writer-producer Carol Dean, author of the best-selling book, The Art of Film Funding, and host of this show. Carol is the president of From the Heart Productions, a nonprofit organization that has supported filmmakers with the Roy W. Dean Grant, fiscal sponsorship, education, and resources for over 30 years. Carol also teaches the Learn Producing class. Each class features an industry expert guest instructor and is designed to give the information, guidance, and support to become a successful producer. You can learn more about this class and all of From the Heart Productions offerings at FromTheHeartProductions.com. Today we are joined by our guest host, filmmaker Heather Lenz, best known for directing and producing the Sundance documentary Kusama Infinity. Our special guest this week is the award-winning documentary filmmaker Jeremy Workman, whose work has been Emmy nominated and Oscar shortlisted. His films include LILY Topples the World, Deciding Vote, The World Before Your Feet, Magical Universe, and most recently, Secret Mall Apartment. Secret Mall Apartment premiered at the 2024 South by Southwest Film Festival and went on to win 9 major film festival awards. It was released theatrically in over 250 cities in March 2025. Becoming the 4th highest grossing documentary since 2020, excluding music concert films. Certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, Secret Mall Apartment was even parodied on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Executive produced by actor Jesse Eisenberg, the film is now being developed as both a stage play and a scripted movie. Today, we'll discuss the film and Jeremy's success making movies that take us deep inside extraordinary worlds.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for the introduction. And thank you, Jeremy, for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. For anyone who isn't familiar with the Secret Mall Apartment, can you please tell us what it's about in your own words?
Of course. And thanks for having me. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Heather. So exciting to be here. Secret Mall Apartment is a super fun one. It's a crazy, bonkers story. So in early 2000, like the early 2000s, specifically 2003, these 8, young Rhode Islanders were mad about a mall that was being built in their hometown, Providence, Rhode Island. And they were mad because it was like, a terrible kind of gentrification situation, and it leveled part of their neighborhood. So they were really angry about this mall. So they decided to do something. So they snuck into the mall one day in 2003, and somehow they found a secret space that was not part of like the stores, not really on any blueprints, kind of in the infrastructure of the architecture. And it was 750 square feet, and they decided to turn it into their own special condo, their secret apartment, as some sort of act of like, standing up to this mall that had come into their neighborhood. They kept it going, this secret apartment, for 4 years. And they filmed everything along the way. And it's this remarkable, crazy story with crazy, crazy footage that they filmed. And I'm really fortunate and lucky and thrilled and honored that I was the filmmaker that got to turn this into a documentary. A lot of people had been chasing this movie for so many years. So I was really pumped when I was able to kind of, convince everybody to let me make the documentary.
Well, you did an amazing job, and it is just an extraordinary story. It's super fun to watch this film. And how did you first hear about this story?
It's so crazy because it's like one of those things where It's like these kind of like serendipity of life kind of things. I was in Athens, Greece. I was filming for another documentary that was mentioned, in our intro. LILY Topples the World. And LILY is the world's greatest domino toppler. She's the most acclaimed domino toppler on planet Earth. And her videos on YouTube have been seen, practically a trillion times. If anybody of your listeners have seen domino videos like on YouTube or TikTok, it's probably Lily. So I was making a film on her, and I was in Greece, and the Lily was like doing a collaboration with the creator of the Rubik's Cube, Erno Rubik, and I was filming everything. And the building that we were in was covered in masking tape art. Okay, so this is artwork where like you use masking tape to, create like these incredible images on the facades of walls and buildings. And it turned out that the artist behind the tape art was Michael Townsend, who was the guy in the mall, was the person that like was the ringleader of this whole crazy mall story. And he and I met in Athens and hung out, and I was out there filming and he was out there doing his tape art, and we ended up just spending a lot of time over a week and got to know each other. We realized very soon that we like were very like-minded, had a lot of same sensibilities. And he told me, he was like, "Hey, I was the guy that lived in the mall." And I had no idea what he was talking about whatsoever. I had never heard this story. I'm not from Providence. And lo and behold, he showed me footage and I was just kind of blown away. I couldn't believe this was real. And then I spent probably the next year trying to convince him and all the other 8 participants to let me be the person to make the documentary. And it was, not an easy process, but yeah, that's how it all went.
Wow, that's super interesting. Well, I'm glad they picked you. And once you got permission, how did you begin the process of making the film? I mean, were you going through archival? Did you start filming? What did you do?
So what was incredible about this story, and I mentioned this at the top, and people who see the film or have seen the film, they know that, the footage that Michael and the other participants filmed when they were living in the mall, it's just astounding. And, again, I didn't really know there was so much footage. They filmed 25 hours of footage when they were inside the mall, and they filmed it with this like crappy camera that they probably bought at Radio Shack for $100. And but there was 25 hours. So I sort of, at that point realized, wow, a film could really work here. And if I use that footage, their footage, as the kind of the spine of this story, I could tell this really incredible story about, that was more than just this prank. It was more about all these other things that these artists were doing and why they did it and what was going on in Providence and all this other artwork that they were also doing simultaneously. So I kind of pitched them on that, like a bigger context of this story, and not just, hey, let's make a documentary about this prank. And they all said yes. And then I set about to raise the money at that point. I didn't go to any companies. I rarely do that with my films. I go to a very inner circle team of people who I've met, in my journey, who are interested in, funding documentaries or being involved in the financing of documentaries. So I brought this to that team, and after, about 8 or 10 different people coming on board on that side, that funding side, we were ready to go. And I started filming, right after the pandemic.
Well, yeah, it's great. That's cool to hear how much footage they had. And what was the most challenging part of making the film?
Well, it was certainly challenging for a few reasons. One was to convince all 8 of these people to let me make the documentary. This was a group that was kind of a little bit didn't want didn't want the spotlight. They didn't want to have a documentary. They loved the idea that, this had become kind of part of Providence urban legend. And they loved the idea that it was kind of, something that was kind of whispered and nobody really knew a lot about. But I had saw this opportunity to bring it back out into the world because a lot of the issues that were at play were about gentrification and about kind of the commodification of our cities. Those are still relevant today, particularly in Providence. And I also was very interested in all the artwork that these 8 people were doing. They weren't just, young troublemakers. They weren't punks. They were these incredibly committed artists who were doing a lot of charitable work at the same time they were in the secret apartment. And a lot of that charitable work was this kind of charitable public artwork where they took no money and got no acclaim. And I started to realize that that was part of the story. And that was how I convinced them. And I think just looking back, that might have been the hardest part of the process, was just convincing them to do the movie. And then looking at it in this big picture way so that it wasn't just about a prank, but it was something more. And I think that was probably the biggest challenge.
Well, yeah, it is a super interesting story with all these layers. And yeah, one thing that really struck me was how these factory spaces in America have become these abandoned spaces. And then, of course, the mall came in and properties were demolished. And then now many, many malls are becoming vacant spaces because everyone buys their stuff from Amazon, you know? So it's interesting how it's like cyclical, which spaces are used and then abandoned. And so you've touched on how you funded this, that you have this inner circle and it sounds like you don't typically go pitch to streamers, but did you apply for grants or what, were you able to just really fund this through your own connections?
Yeah, I think it was around, in 2014 I did a small documentary on an outsider artist, and it was called Magical Universe. And yeah, your listeners should find it and watch it. It's really an important film for me, and I thought it came out really well. And that was the first time when I decided to not try to go to any companies, not try to even go to grants. I think I had kind of felt around that time that I was interested in stories that were unusual, maybe different. That I'm not interested at all in celebrities. I'm not interested in true crime. I'm just not interested in a lot of the kind of stories that big production, entities need in terms of, mainstream kind of audiences. That it's just never been why I've been interested in documentaries. I'm much more interested in, smaller stories about people and how the ordinary people among us are extraordinary. That's always been something that I'm focused on. So as a result of that, I think I realized kind of early on that I wasn't going to necessarily walk into a big streamer and say, "Hey, I'm doing this documentary on this quirky subject. Will you give me $1 million?" I started to realize that the better way for me was to kind of, find like-minded people who were interested in being involved in the process, but maybe aren't filmmakers. They come, with different backgrounds, and inviting them into the process, and then making the movie with that team, and kind of very much treating that as a team, that they are now involved in a way that, is not how the big streamers work. And I think I did that, like I said, I did that first with Magical Universe, and it was very low budget, but that movie ended up doing pretty well. It was acquired by IFC Films. It made it onto Netflix. It suddenly turned a profit, even though it was very small and modest. And that kind of set me on the realization that, like, wow, I could make documentaries and actually make a profit, which was oddly something that was not an assumption at all in the documentary community, within the last few years. Most people were making documentaries on the assumption that they don't make profits and that you need to go to grants or streamers and have somebody write a check because it's not a commercial proposition. So I'm always interested and have been interested and continue to be in upending that and trying to look at the documentaries that I make as, they're valuable assets. And that's how I make them, and that's how I approach them. And I think about budget, and I think about keeping the costs down, and I think about how is this movie going to find an audience and sell tickets and make its money for my investors.
Well, it's inspiring to hear you talk about this. So I'm super happy you're here. And so once you started shooting this film, how long did that part of the process take?
Probably for shooting, it was probably about 2 years. I ended up doing about 30 interviews. As I mentioned previously, there was 25 hours of footage, which, is incredible. And, really, as I indicated, it became the spine of the whole documentary. However, your listeners know that sometimes on archival documentaries, you have hundreds of hours. So it was very limited. And so I had to shoot a lot of interviews. And I also shot a lot of things where I wanted the movie to start kind of playing a little bit with genre, playing with, breaking down the kind of the formal structures, kind of being a little bit more playful with presentation. So there's a number of things in the movie, whether it's recreations, whether it's scenes where subjects are involved in the making of the movie. There's scenes with models. There's all kinds of stuff that's in the movie beyond just this story of the secret apartment, but it all obviously connects.
Right. And how long did it take you to edit this film? And were you editing while you were filming, or how did that work?
I did something that I thought was really interesting. And by the way, I'm an editor by profession. That's what I do when I'm not making my own films. I've been an editor my whole life. So I feel really comfortable and confident in the edit room. However, on this movie, it was the first time when I brought in another editor to work alongside with me. And that was an editor named Paul Murphy, who lives in Australia, and he's terrific. But we did something also really interesting. As I mentioned, there were all these scenes where they filmed their footage, where they filmed this original footage, and it was about them sneaking into the mall and building the apartment. And it's these incredible, almost like Sugar Rush scenes. They're so fun. They're it's like a heist movie, but it's like Ocean's 11, but it's almost like, it's almost like a reverse heist now that I think of it. They're not stealing from something, they're bringing things in because they're building their apartment. So they're sneaking in couches, they're sneaking in tables, kitchenettes, a television, and in their ultimate maneuver, they decide to build a brick wall that concealed them even more inside the secret apartment. And all this they filmed. And then, as I also mentioned, the movie has all these other little tentacles. And as you also mentioned, Heather, there's all these other things and textures in the movie. So what we did on the editing that I thought was so interesting was Paul edited all the archival footage, these scenes that were like these fun heist, as I described them, almost like Sugar Rush scenes. And I edited all the stuff that was more, contextual, the stuff about gentrification, about art, about all these bigger issues that were going on. And we siloed each other. We did not share what we were working on. And this went on for several weeks where we would just maybe like months where we were literally siloed in the opposite part of the earth. He was in Australia, I was in New York, and we didn't know what the other ones were working on, what each other was working on, and how each other's scenes looked. And it created this really interesting approach that was right for this movie. And it gives the movie this really kind of unique flavor where it's kind of bouncing between these two worlds. But it's all, it's all synergistic. It's all adding up to something more. But it gives it this very interesting sort of, where you're kind of tiptoeing between these worlds. And it turned out to be a great approach. It took about a year plus of editing.
I love hearing about your process. That has to be the most unusual edit story I've ever heard in my life. So I love that.
Yeah, I mean, when I told people like, yeah, there was two editors on this and we never were looking at each other's work. And of course, I mean, for your listeners, of course, we eventually brought each other's scenes in and really reviewed them and integrate them and make sure that like everything was kind of working cohesively. But for months, we were just like the job was make the best scene that you can, and don't worry about what I'm working on and what you're working on and how it's going to all fit together. Don't worry about that. Just make the best scene. And that's what we would do. We would just say, okay, you have this 5-minute scene or a 10-minute scene where they're going to sneak in cinder blocks into the mall and build a wall. Go for it. And that was the job. And it really worked out incredibly in terms of that process.
Yeah, it's great. It's like I said, it's great to watch. And so for you, what has it been like to watch this film with audiences?
It's been great. As as you mentioned in the intro, this movie had this really successful theatrical release. It was unlike anything I could have. I mean, I didn't dream it would be this good and this big. We, have done really well in so many cities. We've we released theatrically. We decided that was how we wanted to release the movie. We didn't just kind of drop it, take the first offer from a streamer. We really made an effort to, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to put it in theaters? How are we going to get people to come out to see a documentary? And that became our focus for 2025. And watching it in theaters has been incredible because, you're talking about this movie that's really audience friendly. It's a great time at the movies. It's very entertaining. It's very fun. You cheer for it. It's funny. So we knew that it was going to be right for an audience. We knew that theaters would be great, a great venue for it. So just being in those theaters and experiencing that has been a blast, and it's been so fun. I think since the movie has come out at film festivals and now, I think I've done about 80 Q&As, which is incredible. Think about that, 80 Q&As. And the main subject, Michael, I think he's over 100. So also just this aspect that we're very much kind of, participating with the film with audiences has also been incredibly fun and gratifying and something that I want to, kind of do again with other films.
Well, maybe if we're lucky, streamers are listening and we'll decide people are interested in more than just true crime and the handful of things they seem to want to support these days.
Sure.
And could you, talk a little more? I mean, again, you've already talked about it a bit, but could you talk a bit more about the process of releasing the film, starting with the premiere and going into the theatrical?
Of course, because I think that adds this, this other really fascinating part of the story of Secret Mall Apartment. When we released it at South by Southwest, and I had previously had other films at South by and at other festivals that had attracted buyers. And, even in the case, for example, of LILY Topples the World, that was like a big big acquisition by Discovery. And I think we kind of all assumed, thought, hoped, dreamed that, a streamer would kind of jump in and instantly want that. They would see that, like, wow, this movie is just, packing audiences at every festival, and it's, viewers love it. But we, as everybody knows, and as your listeners know, we suddenly hit this like downturn with streamers and buyers, and suddenly everybody didn't want anything, and they were worried about everything, and they were worried about, finding audiences for movies, and they kind of retreated to genres that they felt were safer. So when I started to read the writing on the walls a little bit and kind of got a sense that, like, okay, this is going to have to be really different. And then we decided to make this very bold step of self-releasing Secret Mall Apartment. In other words, not waiting for a distributor, not waiting for a streamer, not hoping that somebody would come and acquire it, but releasing it on our own. And in the years, a few years ago, when filmmakers would self-release their film, sometimes it felt like, filmmakers were kind of throwing in the towel a little bit. Like they didn't get any offers, so let's just self-release it ourselves and put it in a theater or two. But we actually had the opposite kind of outlook. Our vision was that we're doing this because we want to own the movie. We want to release the movie, and we see incredible potential in releasing it ourselves. And we don't need these distributors who, frankly, these days don't even seem that great at their job. They seem kind of like, as we mentioned, they're very concerned about just kind of going into corners that they know they could find audiences. So we came to it from a place of, being very bold and bullish. And I think that very much became our attitude in the entire process. And it was borne out in how well it did. That this was a movie that we released ourselves, and everything was better because of it.
Well, one thing you said that struck me is about, your broad approach to the theatrical release, because it is true. A lot of times people are just focused on basically doing a week in New York, a week in LA, because they want to, you know, potentially be able to qualify for an Oscar, you know?
Yep.
And so do you have any, advice generally to offer indie filmmakers who are trying to do a theatrical release like you that's larger than trying to get those 1 week runs in just two cities, you know?
Yeah, for us, we were very much thinking about how do we subvert and disrupt that playbook, and we really were thinking about anytime there was something like, oh, well, we have to, this is how you do it. We were trying to immediately say, well, let's come up with let's try to subvert that and do something different. For example, just as you said, a lot of films and a lot of documentaries, they say, well, let's release in New York and Los Angeles. Sometimes that's for awards consideration, but sometimes they're just also like, well, that's because that's where you do it and that's where the audiences are. And we looked at that and we said, well, in Los Angeles, it's not great. Documentaries do not do great in Los Angeles in theaters. A lot of people do not come out for documentaries in theaters in Los Angeles. There's also been a real reduction of art house movies that play documentaries in Los Angeles, particularly with like the closing of the Landmark and the ArcLight. So we were like, well, what we don't, let's not focus on Los Angeles. And then we started to think about New York, and obviously I'm from New York, and there's lots of interest in documentaries here, but it's also not great in terms of the breakdown with theaters in New York City. The percentage, and I know we're getting into the weeds a bit, but it's super interesting. The percentage in New York is not as good as the percentage in other cities. And it has to do with rent, and it has to do with all these things that you're mentioning, where filmmakers traditionally release their movies in New York and LA. So we were like, well, how do we change that? How do we upend that? And we decided to focus our premiere in New England. We premiered in Providence, and we decided we want to premiere at the mall where this happened. And that became this, rallying cry. Like, okay, we want this movie, Secret Mall Apartment, to premiere in Providence at the mall where it happened. And that it wasn't easy to make that happen. There was a lot of moving parts, but we ended up premiering there in March of this year, and it played at that theater for 6 months. And I think it was their number two movie of the year at that theater behind Sinners. So it outgrossed every single Hollywood movie except Sinners this year. And then as of a week ago, that movie theater closed. It's the mall's still open. The mall where this all happened is still open, but that movie theater is now closed. So we basically were there the entire run. Um, Additionally, there was all these other things that we would think about. We would think about, well, the playbook says you do this, and we would say like, okay, well, let's try to do something else and do something different. Another funny, just random example is, oh, you make one poster. That's how you do it. That's how they've done it for 100 years. Make one poster, and that becomes your key art. And this is how you do it. Of course. Well, we were like, all right, well, we're going to have 5 posters. I think at the end we had 7 posters. And we used them. Sure, like certain posters became like the main poster, but we had 7 posters in circulation. So we were always looking for ways to kind of shake things up. And I think that also worked really well for the film.
Jeremy, this is so fun to hear about. This is like a master class in indie film distribution. So thank you so much. And so I've never heard of a documentary getting parodied on The Tonight Show, but yours did. And I'm wondering what it was like to be contacted by Jimmy Fallon's team about your movie.
It all starts with our executive producer, Jesse Eisenberg, who I definitely want to, point out how important he was to everything that we were doing. So I think Jesse and I are friends, and this is the second movie of mine that he's been an executive producer. He doesn't, and obviously your listeners know him. He's this great actor. He had this terrific movie last year that he directed, A Real Pain. Of course, he played Mark Zuckerberg in Social Network. But he also loves just kind of being a champion for, unique kind of films and unique artists. And he has, like I said, has been involved in 2 of my movies, and he doesn't really want anything in return. He doesn't put money in or anything like that. He just is a cheerleader and a champion. So he has been shoulder to shoulder with us in the entire release of the film. He's done a bunch of Q&As, a ton of like virtual Q&As, a lot of press stuff. And when we realized we were going to release, we were like, okay, how do we really take advantage of this as best as we can? And that's when we reached out to the Tonight Show and kind of, we kind of dangled Jesse. He had just was coming off the Oscars with A Real Pain, and kind of said, hey, well, Jesse would be available on the Tonight Show, but wants to talk about Secret Mall Apartment. And then that developed from there into this idea where Jimmy Fallon was like, okay, well, I want to parody this movie. And they did The Secret Desk Apartment, which was the idea where somebody was living under Jimmy Fallon's desk all these years and nobody knew. It was very funny. And it was like this running joke throughout an entire show.
I love it. It's super cool. So the Secret Mall Apartment is currently being developed as both a stage play and a scripted movie. And can you please talk about how these opportunities came about and what your role is in these productions, if any?
Well, it's in both cases, it's super early. We have always felt that this movie lends itself to such, a fun exploration of other ways to show this story because this story is so incredible. So right off the bat, there was immediate interest from lots of people in turning this into something else. And we've just been kind of exploring that with producers that are interested. There's really nothing, firm happening with that, but there's just been a lot of ongoing interest. And now there's starting to be some companies that are developing it.
Well, I love that. It kind of makes me think of Grey Gardens because that got turned into not only a scripted version of the documentary, but also a musical, which is pretty wild to think of a documentary being turned into a musical.
Totally, and I know the documentary Queen of Versailles is also being turned into a musical now, and that's neat. And Hands on a Hard Body, a great documentary. I want to say that was turned into a stage play, but I don't know if it might have been a musical. I don't know exactly. I'm sure some listeners will know.
I feel like I should know that because
Yeah,
but I think it may have been. I think there are two that have been turned into musicals. So I'm sorry I don't know off the top of my head, but yeah.
sure.
Um, so how have the participants in Secret Mall Apartment reacted to the success of the film?
They love it. All of them are still artists. They're all still, hardworking artists with a lot of integrity. They're none of them are, I put it this way, like none of them are sellouts. They don't care at all about success. They don't really care about money. They have just high integrity, but they've really enjoyed this process. And I think they've also found that the film has been is really honest. It's honest about their story and what they were doing and their intentions. And I think, all appreciate that this is a documentary that didn't just go with like, hey, let's tell this in the most like sensational New York Post kind of way, but rather, it's almost like, I don't know, like Man on Wire or something like that. Another movie that was turned into a scripted, another documentary that was turned into a scripted movie. Um, it was turned into The Walk. But I think the participants of Secret Mall Apartment have really enjoyed the process.
Well, good. Well, hopefully it leads to other opportunities for them. Like you said, that guy doing the tape art, that's just super cool too. So,
Yeah, that's Michael Townsend. His stuff's incredible and people can find his stuff at tapeart.com. But of course, his tape art's featured prominently in the documentary. So folks can see a lot of his great work in the documentary.
so you often direct, produce, edit, and shoot your films. Can you please talk about the pros and cons of that and what you like and dislike most about the various roles?
I think that's that. I have no cons with that other than it's difficult. It takes a lot. It extends the time. It extends the timeline and it creates, maybe like physical and stamina challenges. But other than that, there are no cons. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to continue doing that, however, because it's an enormous investment of time and effort to shoot and edit. Secret Mall Apartment was the first movie that I didn't edit completely. My newest documentary that I'm finishing up now, I wasn't the editor. On as I'm doing more, I'm finding myself editing less and shooting less, which is probably a natural evolution. But I love shooting. I love editing, and I really see making the movie. That shooting and editing is part of the holistic process of making a documentary. Documentaries are so much, about the shooting and the editing. They're not, there's no, nobody's scripting, there's no actors, obviously. So they become an art form where you're really focusing on the shooting and the editing. And so that's why that becomes so important to me is thinking about what to shoot, how to shoot it, what it's going to look like, you know, and even real technical stuff, what kind of lenses using and what kind of cameras and what the look of the movie is. And then of course, when editing, how to construct the scenes out of that. So always that was my approach. And the only downside is that it just really adds to the timeline in such a degree. So I'm like I said, I'm starting to phase that approach out a little bit.
Hmm. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss all of your other films because you've done so much great work. But since your documentary deciding vote was Oscar shortlisted in the documentary short form category and also Emmy nominated for most outstanding short documentary, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a bit more about your journey with that film. It covers a politician who sacrificed his career to vote for women's reproductive rights, and it was distributed by The New Yorker. And I'm wondering how they got involved with the film and at what stage.
That was a movie that, yeah, it's called Deciding Vote. It came out in like 2023. It is 20 minutes. So it was a bit of a departure for me. Most of my documentaries are, they're more verite. They're not necessarily historical. They're they're like ride-alongs in present tense. Secret Mall Apartment isn't completely that, but it's still very much contemporary and it follows characters with a lot of verite footage where that I'm shooting. Deciding Vote was somewhat different. It was this incredible story that somebody told me about, and I was so interested in that story and couldn't believe that it wasn't more well known. This was about this assemblyman in 1970 who switches his vote on abortion, and as a result of switching his vote, it got the bill passed in 1970 in New York and ultimately led to the legalization of abortion in New York. And then that bill was used to as a model for Roe versus Wade. So it was this incredibly huge, important story, and I just felt like I had to do whatever I could to make it. I made it first. We raised the money again independently, and then we made it. We made it as good as we possibly could. And then after it started to premiere at festivals and win awards, that's when the New Yorker came on board, and that's when like it became, one of the short documentaries that are in kind of this award contention conversations, and it ended up getting shortlisted. And
Well,
yeah, folks can still find it on the New Yorker. It's on, their channel. I think their YouTube channel, and it's this great tight 20-minute story with a lot of archival and really interesting, powerful interviews.
well, to touch on another one of your films, your 2018 film, The World Before Your Feet, about Matt Green walking every street in New York City, which involved walking over 8,000 miles. It returned to theaters this summer and had a few sold out shows. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the process of re-releasing the film. I mean, like one thing I'm curious about is like, did you have distributors or did you not have distributors? And if you had them, like, were you encouraging them to put it back in theaters or how did
Hmm.
that work?
So that was a movie that also did really well on its theatrical release. When it was released in 2018 and 2019, I think it played in 100 theaters, 100 cities, and it probably grossed like 600, 700,000 in box office. And it sounds kind of quirky and kind of like fun, like an odd little movie. It's about Matt Green, who is this guy in his late 30s who's walking every street of New York City, and that's all he does. He lives off $10 a day, if that. He's doing it as a way not to like write a book or to become a tour guide, but he does this as a way to sort of better understand his world and better understand the people in the world. And he's fascinating. And he agreed to let me make a film on him. He and I were friends before I started making the movie, and he said okay. And then that movie came out, and it was acquired by Greenwich Entertainment and Kino Lorber, and like I said, did really well when it came out in 2019. We were thrilled by it, and had a number of fans. And what happened was Matt, what's fascinating about the documentary is that Matt doesn't finish. It's not one of these documentaries, like I don't know, Free Solo or something, where the main subject finishes his quest. He never finishes his quest. It just becomes so gargantuan for him that he's not able to finish it. And yet this, and like I said, I made it in 2018, 2019, but then Matt finished it, his entire walk. He finished the entire walk of all five boroughs. It amounted to about 12,000 miles, and he finished it in 2024, around this time last year. And there was this sort of new blast of publicity about, oh my God, Matt Green finished his walk. The guy that was in The World Before Your Feet, he finished his walk, and there was new articles and press and news stories. And at that point, theaters kind of were keyed in, especially around here, and we're exploring this idea. How about we put it back in theaters, and we involve this idea of, again, and this comes back to what we were talking about before, which is, thinking about ways to disrupt how you're releasing your movie. And theaters were kind of thinking about, hey, what if we put this movie back in theaters and also had community walks in conjunction with the release? And we were so on board, and Matt led a bunch of walks, and suddenly we were in a bunch of theaters this past few months, and crowds have been great. We just played at the Nighthawk in Brooklyn a couple weeks ago, totally sold out, and it was followed by a walk with Matt Green. So yeah, it's a reminder that, movies have a long timeline, a long lifeline, and there's always going to be interest in stuff you make, and there's ways to kind of bring it back out to the world.
I love that. It sounds like his walk is like the city version of people doing the Appalachian trails, you know? I
Yeah.
I wonder how the length compares, but
Sure. I think somebody actually once figured out that it was similar in length.
interesting.
But Matt, or Matt's fascinating. And yeah, I encourage people to watch that movie just because I'm so in awe of Matt, and I think that viewers watch the documentary and they get to discover Matt. And I really think, for that purpose alone. So yeah, your listeners should check it out. The World Before Your Feet. You could find it all over the place.
Great. And what advice do you have for aspiring documentary filmmakers?
I think it has a lot to do with some of the stuff that I've probably already said, in our conversation, but like kind of like not, but trying to think, and I know it's a cliche to say like, well, think out of the box, but I think that's really important, and not just saying like, oh, okay, well, this is how you're supposed to do it, or this is what the book says to do, or this is what the way that the streamers want it, and just kind of like throw all that out the window and just try to tell great stories, and try to tell great stories in engaging ways, and think about the audience, think about you as a viewer, you as an audience member, and like what you like, and not so much think about external factors that you can't really control. So I think if there's any advice, it's just, go try to make a movie, try to make a documentary. It doesn't need to be super high budget. Documentaries have a very, low bar in terms of, kind of entry level. And obviously, there's some documentaries that are quote unquote premium, but you don't have to do that. You could aspire just to make a documentary about an interesting subject, and you could make it in a way that, feels kind of more DIY. And you could, cameras are cheap, and there's a lot of shooters, and there's a lot of editors, and editing software is readily available. So it becomes easier and easier to figure out how to make a documentary. And that's what I would encourage people who are listening.
Great. And for anyone who's interested in following your career, can you please share your social media handles and your website?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love anyone to follow me. Always in the quest for followers. On Instagram, I'm Jeremy Workman _. And of course, on Instagram, there's Secret Mall Apartment. And my website is jeremyworkman.com. And anyone can feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Great. And can you please let our listeners know where they can currently see the Secret Mall apartment?
Secret Mall Apartment is available now after we've done our theatrical run. It's now available on digital. So anyone can, go onto Google and type in Secret Mall Apartment or documentary on people that lived in the mall. And it'll come up with, Amazon options, iTunes options, YouTube rentals, Google Play rentals. We're just on digital now. We're not on a paid streamer. We're doing our own digital, sort of in the spirit of our self-release. And, just in the same way that it was important to get the word out when we were releasing them theatrically, we're also trying to do the same digitally. So I'd love any listener to check it out. And like I said, feel free to write a review or let me know what you think, and would love you to check it out.
Great. And is there anything I didn't ask you about today that you'd like to add?
Oh, I'm doing a crazy new movie right now. I just finished a new movie that no one's seen. It's not officially done yet, but it's called School for Defectors. And I made a documentary in Korea where I was going out to Korea quite a bit. And I was embedded at a tiny school in Korea, has 20 students. It's a boarding school, and all 20 are North Korean defectors. And it's a really incredible story, and you follow these kids as they are navigating just, being teenagers, but also with this kind of heavy thing, hanging over them, which is that they are from North Korea and they're adapting to life in South Korea and everything that means. So I'm finishing that now, and I hope to find audiences with that in 2026.
Well, that sounds super interesting. I didn't even think that it was really possible to get out of North Korea. So
It is exactly. It's
Interesting.
not easy, but there's about 20,000 defectors in South Korea, and they come in all kinds of variety ways, not just from North Korea. Some of them come from China and other countries, but they're basically all originally from North Korea.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for taking the time to join us today and share so much wisdom and great tips with our listeners. We just really appreciate it.
My pleasure. What a fun chat. I really appreciate the opportunity and getting to, blab away about all things Secret Mall Apartment.
Yeah, well, I hope anyone who hasn't seen it should definitely go check it out. It's just a great film. So
Awesome. Thank you.
Now, in its second edition, Carol Dean's popular book, The Art of Film Funding, has 12 new chapters to cover all areas of film financing and how to avoid expensive pitfalls. Learn how to start with an idea and end with a trailer, how to make an ask for money, create your story structure and your trailer, legal advice, fair use, successful crowdfunding, how to ask for music rights, and what insurance you can't shoot without. Available on Amazon under Carol Dean and at FromTheHeartProductions.com. I want to remind our listeners that David Rakelin is a brilliant and talented award-winning musician who scores films and can compose music for a trio or for a full orchestra. David is a very good friend to the independent filmmaker and comes highly recommended by From the Heart Productions. If you need music to help tell your story, please contact him at davidrakelin.com. That's David, RAIKLEN.com. And Carol and I want to thank you for tuning in to The Art of Film Funding. Please visit our website at FromTheHeartProductions.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Good luck with your films, everyone.